Thanks, Arnaldo, for giving me this honor to introduce our world-class speaker, Mr. Kirby Ikin, where he will present transformation of the global space industry in the 21st century. Mr. Ikin is the Managing Director of Asia Pacific Aerospace Consultants, APAC, located in Sydney, Australia. APAC offers a broad consulting services to the commercial space industry, including market analysis, industry analysis, risk management, and insurance advice. Kirby Ikin has long and varied involvement within the Australian space industry and has held executive positions with various space interest groups. Currently, he is the chairman of the board of the US-based Worldwide National Space Society, NSS, having succeeded Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin in this position. In 1999, Kirby Ikin was the recipient of the National Space Society of Australia's highest award, the Australian Space Pioneer Award. Welcome, Mr. Ikin.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and thank you to all of you for being here. It's a great privilege and honour, and it's very exciting for me. The first thing I noticed as I came into the room this morning was the palpable sense of excitement, the desire to be doing something in space. And you could all quite rightly be saying, why is somebody from Australia, which is not particularly renowned for its space activities, coming to speak to an audience in Puerto Rico? But I hope that during my presentation I'll be able to give you an understanding of why we believe there are some very strong similarities between the Australian space industry, the environment in which it has been developed, and the opportunities that we see both for Australia and for Puerto Rico. And I want to thank Arnaldo. I had my first visit to Puerto Rico in May. As chairman of the board of NSS, we held our annual International Space Development Conference here, and it was an eye-opener to me to see the enthusiasm, the desire to want to participate more fully in the space and the aerospace industry. So my thanks to Arnaldo for bringing me back here, or inviting me back here this time. Now, I realise we're under a bit of time pressure, so I may rush through some of this, and I might skip through some of these slides that I have here, but I'm more than happy to make both the slides available to anybody who's interested. And it is very difficult to see these slides from here, so I apologise if I miss out any of the key points. But I just today want to give you a bit of an overview of how the space scene, the global space industry has changed, a little bit about who I am and the roles that I've had, not to glorify myself, but to show you some of the different aspects of the industry and how they pertain to Puerto Rico. What are the implications of how the space industry is changing? This is probably the single most vital part of the presentation. A bit of a discussion about what are space capabilities, because it's very easy for people to just think about the spacecraft, the launch vehicles, but they don't necessarily understand the much greater breadth and depth of space capabilities. Understanding global supply chains. This is very important in understanding the role that Puerto Rican industry can play in those global supply chains. And I apologise that I seem to have got a bit of a frog in the throat, so my voice is not so great. What's unique in Puerto Rico from my perspective as an outsider? Then finding a pathway forward, some suggestions, although I noticed the comment of our previous speaker saying don't listen to people who make suggestions before they ask questions, although thankfully I've asked a few questions of Arnaldo earlier. And then a quick comment about the much bigger picture of the opening space frontier. And a lot of people, even in the space industry, I don't think realise just how significant the changes are that are coming. So, just a little bit about me so that you understand the different perspectives I'm bringing to this. First and foremost, I'm a consultant in the aerospace industry. My business is, I have to say, I don't have a technical background. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a scientist. I have a law degree and I have a business degree. So I view the world through the lens of what is commercial. And I'm always looking at what is the interface between the technology, the business world, the industry, and often government. I founded the Australian Space Industry Chamber of Commerce. It's now called the Space Industry Association of Australia, but I was one of the proponents of forming this because I thought it was absolutely necessary for the industry to come together as a group. So this is something that I think I share with Arnaldo and with what you're trying to do here in Puerto Rico. We already know that I have the role with the National Space Society. That's an advocacy, public volunteer advocacy organisation that's all about space settlement and development. But I also wear a couple of other corporate hats. I'm the president of Deep Space Industries, one of its founding partners. Those of you who know the name or maybe don't know much about it, it's actually about utilising asteroid resources for in-space applications. So it's one of the new age, new space era companies. But I've also been involved in launch services. I was commercial director of the Asia Pacific Space Centre that was looking to build an entirely commercial launch service, launch site, commercial launch vehicle. It was actually to be based on, that's all right, thank you, on the Soyuz launch vehicle. So I have a lot of experience in looking at those aspects of the industry. Also worked on a satellite life extension program. My point for all of this is to say I've probably looked at the space industry from just about every dimension possible, and I hope and think that there are some useful lessons that you can see from what has happened in Australia, how the global space scene is changing, and how that's relevant to Puerto Rico. I want to talk a bit about the kind of historical changes in the space industry. Then to talk about some of the current trends. You've probably heard the term new space, and that Blue Origin video at the beginning was a classic example of that. Space 2.0, which I think is something different to the new space era. And then to talk a little bit about the new opening of the frontier that's coming. We've recently heard Elon Musk's vision for going to Mars. Jeff Bezos has his vision for off-Earth manufacturing. We have Robert Bigelow with Bigelow Aerospace planning to build commercial space stations. And then companies like Deep Space Industries that are planning to make commercial missions to deep space and return resources. So we've already heard APAC is a Sydney-based consultancy. Where some of this, I think the work that we've done recently is relevant, is that we have done a lot of work for the Australian government when it was trying to formulate a new space policy for Australia. And it wanted to do that based on hard facts about the Australian space industry, where it stood in the global scene, what was reasonable, what could the Australian government do. Now, another interesting analogue here is that Australia is one of the only countries in the world, certainly one of the only countries in the OECD, that does not have a space agency or space office or space program. It's actually quite ironic because Australia is probably the country that most in the world benefits from space technology, yet we have no central space program. And that means that the Australian industry has had to develop on its own without the benefit of government support. Now, you naturally have NASA as a space agency to draw on, but it's the analogue at the territory level. You don't have a space program of your own within the territory of Puerto Rico. So we did studies on space activities in Australia, and there were surprising outcomes in terms of how much was going on. It was a much bigger industry than anybody thought. We subsequently did some work for the European Space Agency looking at what was happening in terms of space capabilities and directions in Asia. And that was a very interesting exercise because ESA was trying to understand how they could cooperate with people in the Asia-Pacific region, and they were also trying to understand what technologies that they could partner with, and they were also trying to understand the competitive forces that might face the European industry in the future. Most recently, we did a study on space capabilities in Australia. This was completed just at the beginning of this year. It was looking at capabilities, supply chains and opportunities for the industry, and it threw up a whole lot of interesting aspects of what the Australian industry can look forward to, and I think it has direct application for Puerto Rico. Now, space, as with many new environments, as they are opened up, it goes through various phases. The first phase is the exploration phase, then the experimentation phase and the exploitation phase. And each of those phases have different characteristics. First phase is a journey into the unknown. It's high risk, it's high cost, it's generally driven by governments, and the business paradigm that we look at in that phase of development is it's driven by government agendas. At their pace, it's funded by governments. And industry, to the extent that they participate, it's following along the government path. Once we get to the experimentation phase, some of the risks have been lowered. Costs are still high, but we're starting to see obvious applications and potential development pathways. But it's still largely governed by governments. It's still at their pace, utilising their funding and going where they would like to go. But once we get to the exploitation phase, things start to become quite different. The technology and the science is much better understood. There's a demonstrated value of operating in that particular new environment. And it's often quite clear that there are unique services that are available. Once we're in this phase, the business paradigm is really now down to business, and it's down to commercial forces that pursue and develop infrastructure, maybe build off and leverage off the infrastructure that the government has laid down. So this is a fairly rudimentary chart in the sense that it shows only 3 data points, and obviously the revenue curve is not linear like that, it's going to be curved. But the 3 data points that we're looking at are quite relevant. 1973, that's the end of the Apollo era, and total revenue expenditure on space is of the order of $15 billion, and it's 80% government expenditure. 1998 is the first year where commercial and government expenditure is equal. At that point in time, it's about $68.8 billion, 34.4 each coming from the commercial world and from the government world. Then we move another 15 years on to 2013, and I appreciate there's a little bit of a lag in the data that we're using when we're doing sort of studies like this. But by 2013, revenue is above $300 billion, and it's now 76% commercial expenditure and revenue. So a very dramatic change in the landscape. And in many respects, those 3 data points represent the exploration and experimentation and exploitation phases. And quite clearly, space is in that exploitation phase. Just another quick graphical representation of this. First of all, it's interesting to look at the cumulative annual growth rates here. These are fairly significant numbers that we're seeing. If you look at commercial space, 13.7% continuous growth rate over a 15-year period. That's a very large number. That's a lot larger than the Chinese economy, by which many people would use as a measuring stick. But you can see that the blue sections of the pie chart, that's military expenditure on space. The greenish tinge, that's civil space. All of the yellows, all commercial. And a lot of people don't fully grasp just how big the commercial component is. And I apologise for the numbers on this chart. It's very confusing. Basically, the globe on the left is the makeup of the 76%. So the numbers don't add up to 100, it adds up to 76. And you can see that the satellite communications is a very large part of the 76%, and global navigation is an equally large number. Also, you will see that within the SATCOMs area, you've got things like direct-to-home broadcasting. One of the biggest changes in the space industry is that where we have typically thought about space being about governments and large corporations, it has now reached down to the consumer level. And this is one of the biggest things. There are literally, billions of devices, like your phone, your tablet, in your car, that are enabled by GPS. And that has transformed the way space activity develops. I might skip some of these details, but one of the points we're illustrating here is that a lot of the largest sectors of the commercial space scene simply didn't exist 30 years ago. And the rapid pace of change is only picking up in that area. I guess I might move more quickly past this. My use of our study in Australia is an analogue, and what it said about the Australian space scene, I believe, is directly relevant to the situation in Puerto Rico. We interviewed 46 companies. The government had us do a study that was a survey in 2010 and 11, but this time they wanted very deep diving detail. So they had us do multi-hour interviews with a number of companies. And for the study, we interviewed 46 different companies. Our objective was to study a cross-section of the community, and as I would imagine to be similar to Puerto Rico, there's a lot of small to medium enterprises, a significant number of outcroppings of large multinational companies. Just like elsewhere, we have Boeing, Lockheed, Thales, Airbus in Australia. Now, when it comes to understanding space capabilities, again, it's very simple for people to think about satellites and launch vehicles, but there's actually quite a number of categories that the global community analyses when it thinks about space capabilities. Space segment's quite obvious. That's what actually goes into space. Launch services, that's pretty obvious as well. That's the launch capability that gets stuff into space. Ground segment, that's somewhat similar as well. It's what controls the spacecraft that's in orbit. But then you have the actual space-enabled services, and that's really the business end of why you put things into space. Then there are support services, accounting, financial, legal, the other things that you absolutely have to have, especially when you have commercial space activities. And then there are other areas of space research and development and education and training. And all of these capabilities are actually important parts of the space industry and the commercial space environment. So, just quickly, again, this is not to inform you so much about the Australian industry, but the scope of what is possible within the space industry. So we surprised ourselves when we found that the companies with space capabilities were generating roughly $2 billion, that's Australian dollars, so that's probably about 1.6 billion US dollars from their space activities. Virtually none of those companies would consider them space companies, but they were companies that had space capabilities. The other, well, first of all, Australia had capabilities in every single space segment that you could imagine. And there were large numbers of staff being employed. It was all across Australia. And the one that's very important, that bottom point, is that every single part of the Australian economy, every different industry classification was a customer for those space services. And again, I would imagine it would be the same story if you looked at the Puerto Rican economy. Space services would be a part of every single dimension. I might pass by this, but again, its main point here is that in the context of Australia, the biggest areas of activity were space-enabled services and ground segment. We don't build spacecraft, we don't have launch services. I'll skip that. This again just represents the different areas of the economy in which space capabilities are utilised in Australia. You see forestry, mining, fishing, defence, federal government, local government, but every single part of the economy is making use of the local space capabilities. Some other interesting characteristics that you see, and again this would be directly applicable and the same in Puerto Rico, there's a very high technical bias in the staff. They're highly educated, highly qualified. A lot of people with degree level qualification, masters, PhDs, very heavily skewed to a highly qualified workforce. And interestingly, interesting skewing of the age of the workforce as well. It appreciates people with a lot of experience and a lot of depth of knowledge. The numbers here are not so important as the trend that it reveals. A lot of Australian companies have seen growth in the space industry and they expect to see growth in the space industry. Again, I'm not trying to tell you about the Australian space scene, but again, the analogue that it is for the Puerto Rican economy and industry. and I can't even read this slide when I'm looking at it, so I don't expect anybody else to understand it. It was intended to be a graphical representation of intensity of industry capability. And again, really what it says is that Australia is good in ground systems and space-enabled services, but not so good in the other areas. The one thing that we add when we look at a global supply chain is the people who use and own the satellites. In Australia, we're good at that in the satellite communications area, but we don't own satellites in Earth observation or positioning, navigation and timing. So the analogue with Puerto Rico would again be, you don't own satellites, so you look at the other parts of the supply chain and where you can fit your capabilities into those global supply chains. So what is the new space era? I'm sure many of you have heard us and others talk about it in the past. It was really a phase that was ushered in when a number of US billionaires started spending their own money on commercial space activities, or rather activities that they had a personal ambition for, but they wanted to do in a commercial setting. And there are several very well-known examples: Elon Musk with SpaceX, Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin, Robert Bigelow with Bigelow Aerospace, Richard Branson with Virgin Galactic, although you could argue it's not really Richard Branson, the person, but more the Virgin brand that was investing in Virgin Galactic. A key aspect there is that those people can play by their own rules. They don't have to bring a commercial return to shareholders in the way that a lot of other companies do. And also they changed the economic paradigm away from the cost-plus contracting era of the large aerospace government relationship to more conventional commercial funding and models. But it was also very significant in that it opened the door for other more conventionally funded entities to follow in their footsteps. So companies like Deep Space Industries or Axiom Space, which wants to develop a commercial space station. Orbital Outfitters, which was going to manufacture the flight suits for Virgin Galactic and X-Corp Aerospace. So it provided a pathway where the people who didn't have billions of dollars could follow in a more conventional sense. The other change is what is known as Space 2.0, and sometimes people conflate New Space and Space 2.0, but I think they're fundamentally different. New Space was about going to do things that governments used to do, or into new areas like space tourism and asteroid mining. Space 2.0 is more about the change in capability of small spacecraft and injecting that into the more conventional areas of SATCOMs, Earth observation, global positioning and navigation and timing. And so we've moved from an era, we still have the existing era, we have a new part of the space industry, where instead of having multi-$100 million spacecraft with a 15-year lifespan, highly reliable, very heavily engineered, this moves to low cost, low capital, quick repetition, reiterating the business model, and it's a completely different way to do things. And it comes with a couple of very, very significant attributes. It lowers the capital threshold very significantly, and we're talking now millions of dollars, and in some cases the spacecraft themselves may only be hundreds of thousands of dollars. It also lowers the technological threshold. So both of those things enable a vast array of new players to come into the space industry. It means that instead of it being large corporations, not only can small corporations play, but universities can build spacecraft and do research and development that can then be turned into commercial applications, new businesses. And of course that's now happening all over the globe because most university systems can build their own spacecraft. So this is really quite a massive change. As I say, it doesn't replace the large aerospace component, but it's a new part of the space industry. So what are some of the strengths of Puerto Rico from an external point of view? Obviously, I've talked to Arnaldo at length in the past, but this is a bit of my distillation of what I would see as someone in the space industry, but from outside Puerto Rico. Obviously, your low-cost base, and that's something similar to what you would find in certain other countries around the world. When we were doing our study for the European Space Agency, they were blown away with what could be done with hundreds of thousands of dollars compared to what would have been millions of dollars in Europe. I think it's a similar thing here. You have a story to tell about the high level of engineering skills that you have, but that lower cost base. You have world-class engineers, but a more cost-effective structure. Your location is significant. As we've talked about before, you have a fairly unique array of launch corridors, whether it's for vertically launched vehicles or winged vehicles. So these are attributes to be built on as you look at the emerging new space arena with suborbital tourism, the expanding launch capabilities of companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin. And just Sunday night when I was in Houston, somebody made the remark that, my goodness, we're going to need a whole lot more spaceports. And somebody else said, well, that will be solved when we have inland spaceports. And then I put on my former space insurance hat and said, well, there's a big difference between going out of an inland spaceport versus coming back in. If something goes wrong, you could be aiming your vehicle at half the United States. So that's a non-trivial situation. So your location is actually a very valuable thing in this emerging new space arena. As I said, the Space 2.0 generation has lowered that technical capability and capital threshold significantly. So the industry, in many ways, is coming towards you, just in the same way as it's coming towards Australia. But it's also coming towards other countries like Singapore and Taiwan and various others. But nevertheless, it is coming into the sphere that suits Puerto Rico. And one thing that, this might sound trite, but the simple fact that you have this united vision to want to do something, that is a tremendously powerful thing. There's that saying that necessity is the mother of invention. But if you all want to see something happen here, that's the only way you're going to make it happen. And by working together, and again, similarities here in working with Arnaldo, we had to create a space industry association to try to pull people together in Australia. We had to find ways to do things without government funding. We had to find new applications, new markets, drive the technology, use the intellectual brains that we have in Australia. We have a brain drain, so we need to stop that as well. The bright people who have to go off to the US or Europe to get a job in the space industry. So we've had to be creative, make use of what is happening around us. So for my 2 cents worth, how I would help Puerto Rico move forwards, I'd identify your local space capabilities, and undoubtedly you've got that to some degree. Perhaps you have it to a high degree. What I would say then is understand it also in the context of the way other parts of the world, such as the European Space Agency, how they understand space capabilities. In fact, ESA has a thing called a product tree, and it has another thing called a technology tree. So it analyses technologies and products down to multiple layers of detail. So they can identify who makes not just a particular, or who makes fasteners, but who makes the particular type of fastener. So if you can get that understanding of your space capabilities into that same framework, it makes it very easy for international partners to then come and say, hey, I need this widget. Do you manufacture it? Yes, it's this company over here. And we do it very cheaply, we do it very well, we've got world-class people, and there's a sale. Map those capabilities and then identify the most promising opportunities, see where the technology is going, where it's growing, new developments that are coming along. And there is immense opportunity for innovation as more people in the world become familiar about space technology, whether it's SATCOMs, GPS, Earth observation, and it allows people at a lower level to start innovating. And then explore new areas of opportunity, such as space insurance. In fact, I think I skipped over this in my earlier comments, but probably the largest phase of my career was actually in satellite insurance. And a lot of people said to me at the time, you know, you just can't do that in Australia. Australia's not a space player. How do you expect to build a space insurance industry? And The space insurance industry had started in Australia off the back of, at the time, what was called the Offsets program. Those sort of programs still exist around the world, but Australia was buying its first communications satellite, and one area that it wanted to get into was space insurance. So being told by everybody you can't do it, in 10 years I built that from $2 million a year to $175 million a year. It became one of the 10 largest space insurers in the world. So to me, that is an opportunity that Puerto Rico can seize. It effectively costs nothing because you have insurance companies that already have capital. They just deploy it and use it in a different way. But to use it in a way that taps you into a global market and in a way that provides a necessary infrastructure for activity within Puerto Rico. So think a bit more broadly. There are other opportunities, and be bold in taking steps forward in that arena. So just lastly, this is somewhat a personal viewpoint, but I think that we are at the beginning of a whole new period for humanity. I think the next decade will be pivotal. We have people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos who have not only money behind them, but they have the corporate capabilities that they're developing through their companies, SpaceX and Blue Origin. They have some very large ambitions, but those large ambitions, I feel highly confident, will come to pass within the next several years. I think most people would know that Elon Musk plans to launch a commercial mission to Mars in 2018, and he's going to launch at every Mars conjunction forever, as he says, from here on, and he hopes to launch crews to Mars by 2024-25. Once people start to realise that this is not science fiction, it's not something that's happening in 20, 30, 50 years' time, it's going to be a perception change when people realise, hang on, this is actually happening. And not only is it happening, but it's a company, it's a commercial initiative, which means that if I want to go, if I can find the money, I can buy passage. It's no longer a national program, which means that all of the rest of the people around the world who have bright ideas and a passion and a desire and the money will be able to participate in that. So all of a sudden, you have a huge new market that opens up. Again, a lot of it is about perception. We can do a lot of things now, but we don't necessarily have the commitment of money to go do those things. But once people realise that it's possible, you can imagine the brand names that want to be associated with that. Red Bull on Red Mars, Nike, Samsung. Companies that try to evoke a certain image of themselves. The people who will manufacture the first heavy equipment on Mars, you can imagine Caterpillar wanting to have their logo on the side. The high net worth individuals who will want to be immortalised by having the first settlement on Mars named after them. So in 1,000 years' time, I would give examples of the Trump Tower, Rockefeller Center, the Udvar Hazy Museum. But there are people who will want to stamp themselves in immortality in the future. Then there will be the research institutions that just have to be at the cutting edge. They have to have their people on Mars. They have to have their people on the moon. They have to have them operating in the commercial space stations, doing microgravity research into the new drugs that are going to be developed, and the new materials that will be developed. So what's important here is it's unlocking a sense of belief and opportunity and perception. What's also exciting is that once you get past the launch vehicles and the spacecraft, the capsules and the satellites, nobody dominates that. There is no established world best when it comes to growing plants on Mars or in ecosystems on a space station, life support, the things that go with it. So personally, I believe there is a huge new horizon that's opening up, and Puerto Rico, as well as anybody anywhere in the world, can be a part of that. So I encourage you to think big. So to close, just a couple of quick summary remarks. The space scene has changed dramatically, and it's continuing to change dramatically. Revolution in small spacecraft has changed the scene completely. The capital costs and the technology costs have come down. And the new space era is opening completely new areas for the community. It would be exciting for Puerto Rico to become a much bigger part of this, and I fully believe it can. And thank you for listening to an Aussie from the other side of the world trying to tell you how to build an industry in Puerto Rico. Thank you.